History of the Medieval Aristocracy. The ancient tribal origins of the aristocracy. The medieval aristocracy rose up from the ashes of the Roman Empire, as well as from the Germanic tribal culture. They were Germanic tribal Indo-Europeans who started settling in different parts of Europe and gave up their nomadic ways of life so they could have serfs and live in luxury and power, while still maintaining their warrior way of life. They would defend their territory themselves. They would call it their fief. This is so unlike modern elites who would never get near a battlefield themselves. Instead, they would conscript soldiers to do it for them. In other words, they would enslave the peasants into combat. Such a thing would not have necessarily been unheard of in the ancient world, but it would have been the kings themselves who would still fight, alongside his aristocratic warriors. The peasants would simply be the backup. But now, in modern times, they have become the whole retinue of soldiers. The Germanic tribes adopted Christianity and Roman customs for pure Juvenalian reasons of centralization, in that Roman martial customs and culture were helpful for centralization purposes. Christianity was also useful for advancing these same desires for centralization. This was important for the establishment of European civilization. Prior to this, there was no moves towards civilization at all among the pagans of Northern Europe. Early kingdoms and chiefdoms of the late Roman and post-Roman world. Medieval warlords gradually consolidated under larger and larger kingdoms. At first, they were chiefdoms ruled by tribal war chiefs, but over time, and with the help of Christianity and Roman customs, which were both forces for centralization, these chiefdoms turned into kingdoms and these war chiefs turned into the monarchies of Europe. In the early days, these tribes had widely varying customs. Some had elective monarchies, some were hereditary, some were absolutist, while others had a council which worked alongside the king. These councils were called things, similar to modern parliaments. Some of these things ruled by themselves like republics, and others ruled alongside a king or chieftain, much like a constitutional monarchy, just at a much smaller scale, and with far less bureaucracy and territory. It should also be noted that when I say they had absolutism or constitutional monarchy or republics, that these were not yet fully absolutist or constitutional monarchies or modern republics, because they were still too decentralized because of extremely local rule. When they started to conquer each other more, they were not able to rule such large territories by themselves, so they had to rely on local lords who could rule it for them. This was how feudalism was born. This had a significant impact because the king had little to no enforcement power to make these lords do anything. It was common for kings to call on their lord vassals to go on a campaign, and they would not even necessarily respond. For this reason, it was necessary for kings to have an excellent track record and be able to win battles and be charismatic and inspire large armies of knights and nobles. Or if not, then they would just not follow them into battle, and the likelihood of being challenged by usurpers would be higher if the king was seen as incompetent. Kings were seen as holy figures who you could not challenge, but in practice they were often challenged by ambitious dukes and princes who wanted the throne for themselves. The rise of absolute monarchy against the aristocracy. But this changed when the church, the merchant class, and even the peasants sided with the monarchs against the lords, against the aristocracy. This happened through peasant movements that were funded by the merchant class as well as priests who became the early bureaucracy for the king. This rise of bureaucracy benefited the kings because it led to them being able to rely on local bureaucrats who in turn had superiors who were regional, and finally kingdom-wide, going all the way up to the king himself. This was important because if bureaucrats disobey, then they are fired or given disciplinary punishments. In other words, they have no way of resisting orders because they cannot fight back the way lords can. They have no enforcement powers of their own, the way dukes, counts, and earls do. This meant mass centralization of power in the hands of the king, with the help of the merchant guilds and the church. Also, merchants benefited from this new situation because the kings were often not as strict with regulating them the way lords were. This was a reward for their help in overthrowing the power of the nobles. They could trade and travel more freely than before when local fiefs were the norm. Eventually, noble titles became mostly ceremonial, and so did the concept that a lord owns a particular piece of land. Eventually, they only owned that land and the people on it in name only. This is how nobility started to decline in its prestige and power, but they were not quite an idle aristocracy yet, because they still fought in battle, even at this point. The church became increasingly powerful because priests made up most of the literate population, and therefore were almost the only ones who could do the job of bureaucratic work. And this meant that the bureaucracy was almost exclusively made up of priests. This led to the church exercising more influence over the kings, and it also led to them being more powerful in society generally, because they did not have to deal with the overwhelming power of the nobles above them, like in the past. Nobles who they largely did not like or control, and now they could control the king far more than before. The peasants benefited from this because there was a lot of royal propaganda from the time stating that the king would protect the peasants from exploitation from the nobles. This was a common idea that was promoted at the time. It is interesting in hindsight because it contradicts modern liberal conceptions that kings are tyrants, instead saying that the king is the savior of the people against the elite. A similar idea exists in the East with Buddhism's concept of the world-turning monarch, or traditional China's concept of the mandate of heaven. This concept of a savior king would later be used by men who led populist movements and made themselves dictator in Renaissance Italy and later history, saying that they will protect the people from a tyrannical elite. And while modern liberal tastes would make people today believe that this is just propaganda that people fell for, the truth is that it was actually true a lot of the time. Great kings and dictators did in fact restore liberty and end elite exploitation a lot of the time. In the modern West, we are trained through Marxist and liberal propaganda to see this as always being a bad thing, that this never works out well, that elected populist dictators are always worse tyrants than whatever elite came before. But in reality, that is only true some of the time, and much of the time these populist dictators actually do in fact hold back or even destroy the corrupt elites that were exploiting the people through taxes or forced labor, or even through lack of freedoms or usury. The High Middle Ages and the peak of aristocratic culture and power. During the High Middle Ages, European nobility saw their peak. They had risen out of the post-apocalyptic situation that the early Middle Ages, or Dark Ages, saw in the first few centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and now they had coagulated a new civilization from the strains of Celtic, Roman Hellenistic, Germanic, and Christian influences, and created for themselves a civilization in the truest sense of the word. The era of Charlemagne that existed in the 800s was not a period of high civilization. It was preceded by a period of Roman post-apocalypse and was itself a period trying to get out of that post-apocalypse. Charlemagne was trying hard to bring back learning and culture to what had been several centuries of post-Roman Germanic tribes fighting each other in non-stop war, and in the process forming the early small kingdoms. This was important because in the centuries prior they had been purely Germanic pagan, but now they had been both Christianized and Romanized by missionaries from the European South, where the empire once ruled. This new ideology of Romanized Christianity led to the Germanic tribes who adopted it into centralizing power much more efficiently than they did during the millennia prior, where they had been just Germanic pagan. Prior to this, there were only old cities built by the Romans and roads built by the Romans, and then small castles. It would not be until the High Middle Ages that medieval civilization had really reached its peak and developed into a new and unique civilization of its own. A civilization which clearly has its roots in older civilizations and cultures, even barbaric cultures, yet it also became something unique and all its own. This civilization would have its own unique cultural institutions, such as the joust and the tournament. It would have its own unique aesthetic, characterized by colorful primary colors on their clothes and armor. It would also include other elements such as Gothic architecture and art, while also having their own vibe and way of being. They possessed their own morality and their own very unique interpretation of Christianity, an interpretation which involved the intense worship of saints, as well as a reverence for their artifacts, and a love of warfare and a desire for holy lands and military prowess in the name of Christ. For them, Christ was not seen as a Jewish god who Europeans just happened to start worshiping. He was seen as the transcendent God of the universe, who became human and struggled and died and redeemed the world with his violent struggle, something that the knights and nobles could identify with, being themselves lords who would suffer and die for their faith and for their land and their honor. For them, honor meant upholding their feudal contracts to their lords above them and to the Lord above all, as well as to their vassals and serfs. To them, being Christian did not mean blindly obeying the Pope and his clergy. It meant acknowledging that while they had spiritual authority and were themselves in some way closer to Christ than most, but they were still humans who were fallible and could be negotiated with, or even manipulated and undermined in order to gain politically. And at the same time, they could also be arbiters in disputes as well as take sides in conflicts. And sometimes lords and kings would even find themselves fighting against the church's forces. In the culture of the high medieval aristocrat, it was impossible to imagine not being on the side of Christ, but it was possible to imagine not being on the side of the church. Although it was not considered an ideal position to be in, sometimes it was not even unheard of for bishops and priests in monasteries to side with a king or lord against the main church. Again, this was fairly customary, even if it made people a little wary at the time, because of the theological consequences of what it looked like to go against the church and the papacy. It should also be noted that medieval aristocratic culture was also known for its deep devotion to honor, as well as their ecstatic lust for power and women. They lived luxuriously, yet respected monks and considered themselves good Christians in spite of their warfare, lust, and luxury. They did not see a contradiction in this. They just respected it when they saw monks who took the philosophy of Christianity to its logical conclusion, but they felt no need or desire to take it that far themselves. The peasants and townspeople felt the same way, and even the wealthy and powerful bishops felt the same way. It was seen that every one of them was a good Christian, yet it wasn't expected that they all lived that strict monastic life. It was seen that only those who were extra devoted had to take it that far. Tension between the clergy and the aristocracy. That said, there was sometimes animosity between the church and the aristocracy, as can be seen in the book The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, which was a book full of short stories about love and sex, and was written in part to make fun of the clergy. The church wanted to persecute Boccaccio for his offense against the church, but he was protected by the aristocracy. Aristocrats were very sympathetic to him because, even though the aristocrats saw themselves as worshippers of Christ, they did not always like the church. This is probably why a few centuries later, when the Reformation happened, many of the Germanic princes and the King of England had no problem separating from the church, because they already seemed to have felt this way on some level. It just required some ideological form to crystallize, and Protestantism fit the bill. It is worth noting here that it is not enough for an idea to have incentive and to be popular amongst a powerful class of people. It must also have some way of framing itself and this is double true for any idea that falls significantly outside the Overton window, like rejecting the Catholic Church's authority during the Middle Ages when it was in its heyday and could not be challenged. The time and place must be right for a significant Overton window shift, and when this happens, it will usually still be a significant struggle, because the old powers that be will put up a fight, and because the new believers will have insecurities, and also because the old believers will be on the defensive, or even the offensive when it comes to the established authorities and their established beliefs that they are used to defending and believing in. Aristocrats were not interested in the egalitarian elements of Protestantism. In fact, they overlooked those elements. They were really just interested in the anti-church elements, because deep down, they had been secretly wanting to not have to take orders from the church for centuries. So much so that they overlooked the dangerous egalitarianism inherent in Protestantism that would ultimately be a greater threat to aristocratic power than the church authorities would have been. Marriage and sexual practices of aristocratic men. It is also worth noting that the knights, lords, and kings of the Middle Ages would frequently engage in extramarital affairs with whatever women they came into contact with. It was not uncommon for traveling knights to go to different castles looking for work as freelance mercenaries working for different kings, and in the process, they would sleep with local women who lived in the various countries in which they traveled to. They would do this even if they were already married. They did not consider it adultery for a man to sleep with a woman who was not his wife. This practice extended even into early modern times, where married English aristocratic men in the 1700s would sleep with housemaids and impregnate them, while their wives did not seem to mind. It is also worth noting that similar practices existed among ancient Greek and Roman aristocratic men as well, and even amongst medieval pagan Norsemen. This practice of married elite men taking extramarital lovers and often impregnating them seems to be something that existed amongst these pre-Christian pagan Aryan warrior cultures, while also being something that the church always condemned, but usually had to accept, for lack of an ability to enforce restrictions against it. Although the church did enforce restrictions against the practice of having multiple wives, which was already very rare in pagan Europe, according to St. Augustine, who reports on this in his book The City of God. This became the normal practice in aristocratic Christian Europe for men to have multiple side chicks that he didn't have to support even if they got pregnant. But he could never have more than one wife. And if he did support his mistresses, then it was seen as an affront to his wife, for he is giving away his resources to another woman. It has always been the practice of weaker men. In this case, priests are the weaker men, as they often are, though not always, that they are interested in constraining the sexual practices of stronger men as a way to control them on a physical and psychological level. More on the tension between the clergy and the aristocracy. Another example of this animosity can be seen in Bernard of Clairvaux's book In Praise of the New Knighthood, a treatise on the Knights Templar and the holy places of Jerusalem, which was written at the beginning of the Crusades to justify the Knights Templar. Bernard of Clairvaux was a Benedictine monk, and this can be seen in his contempt for the aristocracy. He condemns the secular knights as being flamboyant and feminine, because they delight in colorful clothing and armor, as opposed to the monastic knights like the Templars, who dress in very basic clothing and armor. He sees simplicity as a sign of masculinity. He also goes on to say that secular knights are going to hell for living a life, quote, by the sword. As Jesus says in the Gospel, Matthew 26:52, while the monastic knights were not, because they were living pious lives while only engaging in violence in an attempt to restore what was God's, in this case, that being the Holy Land. This demonstrates from the priestly perspective how the knights were seen, and how the animosity was coming from both sides, not just the aristocracy. The animosity between the priests and the aristocrats was a common thing throughout the Middle Ages, But at the same time, it should be noted that they often did work together and cooperate very often with each other. Abbots, bishops, and even popes would side with certain kings and dukes and help them in their battles against other monarchs and nobles. The conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the Church. Then we have the Holy Roman Empire. This empire, established by Charlemagne, was something which was initially sanctioned by the Pope, as the Pope was the one who crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans. But in the years after this, it was Emperor Otto the Great who openly challenged papal authority. The Italian city-states would eventually become the battleground for the fight between the Church and the Empire, or the battle between the military elite and the clerical elite. This battle for the soul of Europe would eventually be won by the Church, even though the Protestant Reformation would go on to challenge the Church more successfully in the coming years. Although it was not the same kind of challenge that the Holy Roman Empire had given it, because the challenge to papal authority given by the Empire was one of aristocratic and military power, while the Protestant Reformation was one of peasant and merchant power. While it is true that many German princes and nobles across Europe, and even the English king, joined in on the Protestant Revolution, it was not a movement that was inherently aristocratic. It was inherently mercantile and egalitarian, with some aristocratic support behind it. These princes and nobles probably didn't fully understand what they were backing. Maybe they did not even care, since it did not directly affect them and their power, at least not immediately, since it would be liberalism, not Protestantism, that would end up being especially dangerous to them and their power in the coming centuries, although it could also be argued that liberalism, to a large degree itself, evolved out of Protestantism. So it could be said that these Protestant nobles and princes made their own bed without realizing it. Little did they know what seeds they were sowing, and the plants that would rise up to cannibalize them. But getting back to the conflict between the Empire and the Church, it should be noted that this conflict had its ground zero in Italy. Italy's various city-states were fought over in a large chess game between these two great spiritual forces. These city-states would be fought over internally by the Ghibelline and Guelph parties that were funded by the Church and the Empire from the High Middle Ages through the Crusades and the Late Middle Ages, and all the way through the Renaissance until just before the rise of the Reformation. This was a chess game that played out between the Vatican, based in Rome, and the Empire, which was stationed just outside the Italian peninsula, although it sometimes tried to penetrate into it. And it played out as different city-states fighting each other and fighting internally over who to side with. Some parties were ideological or theological, while others were simply opportunistic and savvy. Sometimes a city would side with the Empire because they were geographically close to the Church and the Papal States, or sometimes a city would side with the Church if it felt under threat from the Empire. And other such Machiavellian considerations were taken into account by these various parties and rulers. There were princes, kings, merchants, people's parties, elites parties, as well as priests, bishops, abbots, and monasteries, and nobles who sided with both parties and both major spiritual powers. It was actually argued at the time, by some, that the Holy Roman Empire was more holy than the Church was, and that the Emperor was a higher spiritual authority than the Pope was, and that the Pope was being rebellious by not bowing before the legitimate spiritual and military authority of the Empire. These Ghibellines believed that the Empire was masculine and the Church was feminine, and that it was the duty of the Church to submit. This view that the Empire was meant to kneel before the Pope was a view that contradicts the idea that the High Priest should show deference before the monarchical royal function. In Arthurian lore, Merlin works for King Arthur, Merlin being a priestly type figure. In the Byzantine Empire, the Patriarch of Constantinople answers to the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. In England, the Archbishop of Canterbury answers to the English monarch. In the Russian Empire, the Holy Synod answers to the Tsar, and even in the Catholic-inspired series of novels The Lord of the Rings, it is Gandalf, a priestly-type figure, who crowns Aragorn king and sees his authority as legitimate above himself and his kingdom. So this view that the Empire and the Emperor has more importance than the Church and the Pope is not a rebellious view. In fact, it is the opposite. It is the priesthood and the Pope who are rebelling against the legitimate spiritual authority of the Emperor. But since the Church won their battle, and since the Empire became increasingly irrelevant, that has meant that history has tended to side with the Church as they are the winners. The notion that the Church has greater authority than the monarch is a sign of the feminine priestly class rebelling against the natural and rightful authority of the Empire. Imperial authority is meant to be the ultimate peak of all human authorities. Only the divine powers are meant to be above the Emperor. It is not surprising then that something like Ultramontanism would develop later in history, only a few centuries later, since it is only natural that since this rebellious priesthood rebelled against legitimate imperial authority, that it would then rebel against all of the legitimate royal monarchical authorities. The Church was out of control and corrupt, since it was trying to greedily take power which was not divinely granted to it, taking power which was meant for the empire, the monarchs, and the nobles for itself. The Church ended up biting off more than it could chew, and it ended up unleashing Protestantism by accident as a backlash against itself for its insatiable greed and corruption. It was during the Renaissance that the Church became increasingly corrupt and insatiably greedy for power and fought and weakened the empire. And then this led to the inevitable consequence that the forces of egalitarianism and mercantilism would rise up in a world where aristocratic and imperial authority had been weakened so much, thanks to the corrupt clergy's actions. This view did not win out in the end, though, because the Guelph view of the Church being all-important and the empire being irrelevant and unnecessary ended up becoming dominant amongst Catholics even to this day. The Jesuit order and the use of Ultramontanism first against the Reformation and then against the monarchies. It is also worth noting that later during the Reformation, the rise of Ultramontanism as an ideology promoted by the Jesuit order within the Catholic Church was an important ideological development at the time, which showed how much the Church had swayed and become too power-crazed for its own good, and how they used this to undermine the authority of both Protestant princes as well as their own Catholic monarchs. This thinking probably grew out of the earlier anti-Ghibelline, anti-empire mentality of the Renaissance. Their fight against monarchy would not stop with the defeat of the Holy Roman Empire. They wanted to go further, and that is not surprising. They became a power-hungry priesthood who wanted more power than they were supposed to have, and the Jesuits became their subversive intel agency that was willing to make it happen by using dirty tactics to undermine the other powers that existed at the time, and probably to this day. This is also why many sedevacantist Catholic monarchist reactionaries to this day believe that the Church betrayed them when they sided with democracy. This, as well as the Church's later embracing of communism, can be seen as their way of trying to undermine all other rulers who rule with divine right, as a way of getting rid of their competition, because if no other divine rulers are left alive or in power, then that leaves the Church as the only one. In other words, the Church went power-crazed centuries ago and have been siding with the left as a way to undermine their old enemies, the monarchs even siding with the devil himself. But this is foolish because they are essentially feeding vipers, and they will probably one day get bitten, and this will lead to their own downfall. When the communists have defeated everyone else, they will finish them off last, just like they are planning on doing with big business. Templars, Freemasons, and an alternative spiritual center for the West in Jerusalem. During the Crusades, there were monastic orders that were also military orders, as mentioned earlier. Their structure was unlike other feudal structures at the time. Instead of a feudal lord with his knights as military enforcers, or a monastic order with an abbot as its leader, they had a structure where they were all monks and knights at once. and they had a Grand Master who would act as their commander. They were known for waging war against Islam in the name of making Jerusalem into a Christian state, but they were also known for being Europe's first international banking cartel, as well as being stonemasons, who very well may have been the precursors to the Freemasons. But they were also known for having strange practices, like allegedly worshipping a statue of a being named Baphomet. But even though they were known for all of these other things, they were still aristocratic warriors, even if they didn't mix with or were different from the other aristocratic warriors. The monastic knightly orders were still filled with men of noble birth, and to be a member of these knightly orders, you had to prove your aristocratic birth several generations back. The church later burnt the Templars, and it is probably because they were seen as a threat. They were seen as trying to create a new version of Christianity, especially since they saw their whole world as revolving around Jerusalem, which is significant because in Catholicism, the whole spiritual world is not meant to revolve around Jerusalem. It is meant to revolve around Rome and Vatican City. Templar spirituality revolving around Jerusalem as a spiritual center means that they were issuing a subtle and explicit challenge to the Pope's monopoly on spirituality. This combined with the fact that the Templars had become a very powerful organization, being both the most powerful bankers in Europe as well as the most powerful military order, meant that if they wanted to go to war with the church, they may have had the power to wage that war. They would also have a lot of support because the Templars were also stonemasons who built many of the Gothic cathedrals across parts of Europe. So many of the people very well may have sided with them, since the cathedrals were so popular and beautiful. It was easy for the people who built the cathedrals to make the argument that they were truly inspired by God instead of the church. The church was also largely influenced by the Medici family, and later during the Renaissance would go on to become completely controlled by them. The Medici were the most powerful banking family in Europe, and were sponsored by the church, so this meant that they were in direct competition with the Templar Order, as they had become the largest banking organization in all of Europe. This meant that the church had to fight the Templars, and they did so. They destroyed them in a mass burning, and many of them probably survived and reorganized as the Freemasons because the Freemasons appeared for the first time in the historical record in 1350, only a few decades after the Templars were burned, and they were known for traveling around the continent and fixing up buildings or constructing them. This is why they were called Freemasons, because they were free, unlike most people in the Middle Ages who were not free, but were peasants who had no choice but to stay where they were and work the land. This gave them a great cover story for why they were traveling around Europe so much, and it allowed them to maintain their connections with each other. It allowed them to keep networking with each other, so they didn't lose contact. I don't believe they were still trying to challenge church authority after this. I think they were happy just to be able to survive and still make a living as carpenters, just like their god once did, which I'm sure they realized and liked. Although it should be noted that a few centuries later the Freemasons would become a front organization for nobles and freemen who wanted to push liberalism and revolution during the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolution. So in a way, their battle against the church did not stop there. It kept going in a different form, with a different ideology to fight the church with. Instead of a Jerusalem-centric form of Christianity, it became a rationalist-centric ideology that they were fighting the church with. The medieval communes and the rise of the burgher class. It became common for these things called communes, or in Scotland burghs, to develop during the 900s onward. These were independent city-states, or more often they were just small towns or market villages which developed independently. They were usually very mercantile, and at first they only existed because they were located in places that were too out of the way, or in areas where the land was too hard for knights to get through easily. Places like marshes, mountains, or thick forests. Or in some cases, They formed because they were simply not strategically important enough for a lord or knights to come and take. But gradually, these places became very market-oriented and became increasingly wealthy and powerful, especially in places like the Low Countries, later called the Netherlands, as well as Italy. As these places grew more and more rich and prosperous through long-distance trade, they eventually became important places for power as well. And these city-states were places of extreme wealth and culture, like no other places in Europe at the time. This was especially true in Italy. Italy, as a country, thrives partially because it is a place where the Mediterranean connects them to the Near East, as well as to the rest of Europe. And for that reason, the city-states there became wealthy and powerful. But why did these city-states form so much in Italy in the first place? The reason for this was that what existed before in Italy was the Ostrogoth kingdom. And the Ostrogoth kingdom became a failed state, and when bishoprics started seceding from it and gaining independence, and the Ostrogoth kingdom was such a failed state that it couldn't even stop them, that inspired other cities to do the same and secede. This led to Italy becoming a patchwork of different city-states, all led by bishops and lords. Then there were mass protests within these newly formed city-states early on, which led to the formation of parliaments and people's parties as a way of pacifying them. This is how many of them became republics. Many of these were also burgher states from the beginning of their secession, during the breakup of the Ostrogoth state. The Norse pagan Viking threat during the early Middle Ages. How did the aristocrats of early medieval Europe react to the threat of the Viking Norsemen? Firstly, it was seen by them as a terrifying pagan threat that was a danger to Christendom. And for the aristocrats, Christendom was simply seen as the civilized world, while the Norsemen of Scandinavia were seen as the uncivilized ones. They were seen as being in many ways similar to themselves, but more barbaric and alien and remote. They were seen as being their savage past, before being civilized by Christ's religion. In reality, they were really just themselves a few centuries earlier. Although they seem to have suppressed this thought, though subconsciously it must have affected them, knowing that they themselves were the same as the godless heathens a few generations earlier, that they were not that distant from it themselves. It should then be asked, what exactly was the big difference between the medieval aristocracy and the pagan Norsemen? And the answer to this is that there simply was not a large difference in morality. They also plundered and pillaged like the knights did. The only differences were that the Norse had slaves while the aristocrats had serfs, and that the Norsemen were often seafaring and not tied to land in the same way that the aristocrats were, although they themselves did oftentimes own land too. They were still mainly a seafaring race of pirates, while the aristocracy was largely attached to their land. The only exceptions would be the free companies and the monastic knightly orders. The aristocrats also saw in the Viking Norsemen their own shadow. They saw the savages that they knew they could be, and they knew they were. Also, and maybe most importantly, the Norsemen did not have any reverence for the monasteries and priests, and this made them seem like savages to the nominally Christian aristocratic warriors. For them, that was a line they would never cross, and if they did, they would be repentant. They would feel bad about it, and in addition, they would also fear supernatural divine wrath taking vengeance on them for what they had done. There were other pagan survivals during the Middle Ages, like the Saxons, but they had already been converted during Charlemagne's time in the 800s. The Norse represented the final group of pagan warriors who held out the longest in all of Western Europe, and they also represented the final fall of the reign of the religion of the old gods, and of the religion of nature worship. They were also the group of pagans who resisted conversion the hardest in all of Western Europe. They were also, most likely, the closest in terms of blood and spirit and geography to the Hyperborean northern civilization from before recorded history. This is probably why they felt most strongly about not converting. They were from a time long before the reign of Christ, and they wanted to maintain their inherent connection to the northern spiritual pole of warrior civilization. What did chivalry and Christianity mean to the medieval aristocracy? Then there is chivalry and Christianity. What was the point of chivalry during the medieval period? Why did the knights so universally adopt it throughout the medieval world? The reason for the rise of chivalry during the High Middle Ages was that the knights needed some kind of ideology to hold themselves back. It was a self-restraining ideology, a moral code of conduct to follow, and it was similar to what happened in Greece and Rome, where the aristocrats created for themselves a series of self-restraining ideologies known as philosophical schools that were designed to hold themselves back and rein in, to some degree, the wildness that ancient Greek and Roman aristocratic warriors were known for. Examples would be Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, etc. This is also the role that chivalry played in the minds of the knights and nobles of the medieval world. They felt they were just too out of control, so they created a self-imposed set of rules and loose codes of conduct to regulate their bloodlust and warrior behavior. This leads to another question, which is, what did Christianity mean to the aristocrats of the medieval period? The answer would be, in the eyes of the medieval aristocracy, they did not see Jesus as the Jewish rebel against the Pharisee priestly class of ancient Israel and anti-Roman agitator that he was. Instead, they saw him as the God of the universe, whose divine energy had coagulated and condensed into human form, and he was able to walk around as a human for a time. And they saw him as dying heroically and tragically. They had an appreciation for the martyrs and monks who they were not a part of, but they still admired as an alternative ideal to their own knightly virtues. They knew the saints sacrificed themselves, and they themselves understood a different kind of sacrifice, a warrior sacrifice, and therefore could relate it to the sacrifices of saints and martyrs. They didn't think of Jesus as being the man who said that the rich would go to hell, or as being the man who said that those who lived by the sword were morally wrong to do so. They either ignored, downplayed, justified, or in some cases may not have even been aware of some of his teachings. Many of them were illiterate, although more were literate than many today would expect, and they were probably more than aware of the opinions of priests and monks who condemned them as being sinners who were bound for hell because of their lifestyle as plundering warrior elites. This is why they protected Boccaccio for making fun of the priests in his book The Decameron. So the aristocrats clearly did not agree with the priests on these issues, yet they still revered the priests and monks sometimes, and saw papal authority as legitimate much of the time, and even revered the relics of the saintly martyrs as being of real spiritual power. In the eyes of the medieval warrior aristocracy, Christ was not a Jew who rebelled against the Jewish priestly establishment to found a new reformed version of Judaism that was less friendly to commerce, more communistic, more egalitarian, and more universalistic, favoring himself as the incarnation of God and attempting to end the ethnic religion of Judaism and replace it with a universal version of the same religion that was open to all races and ethnicities. The aristocrats did not see it this way. In their minds, he was the God of the universe, who did the greatest miracle in history by making himself human, and then dying heroically, and spiritually renewing the cosmos in the process of doing so. And they saw him as approving of their knightly virtues and adventures as long as they protected women and children and clergy, revered the saints' relics, holy sites, other holy artifacts, and God himself, as long as they prayed often and gave generously to the church and to those who needed it. This was the chivalric Christian ethic of the medieval knights, and this is how the medieval knights saw chivalry and saw Christianity. Teutonic knights, knights hospitallers, and Spanish knightly orders. The monastic military orders were not entirely new during the Crusades, since there had already been orders of knights, known as the Free Companies, since the 100 Years' War a couple of centuries earlier. But the monastic orders only developed in response to the beginning of the Crusades. Aside from the Knights Templar, There were other orders of knights during the Middle Ages. The Teutonic Knights were also a major monastic military order who fought and conquered the entire region of the southern Baltic coast, subjugating peasants both Slavic and Baltic. They also fought a crusade against the Russian prince Alexander Nevsky, which led to a battle on a frozen river, where men on both sides were falling into the river as they were fighting. This battle is known as the Battle on the Ice. It was an important battle which occurred in the 1200s and was pivotal during the Northern Crusades. The Northern Crusades are not as well known as the Crusades against the Islamic world. Instead, they were against the Orthodox Christian world. These crusades were prosecuted by the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights were pivotal to the foundation of commercial cities such as Königsberg, Marienburg, and Riga, which went on to join the Hanseatic League. They established these trading cities to gain wealth and influence, and when those cities became independent, they formed their own league to protect each other. This is another example of the formation of the merchant city-states, or communes. Many of these monastic orders ended up being important in developing the commercial side of European civilization, which went on to largely define modern Europe. It is ironic since the monastic military orders were aristocratic, and the aristocratic warrior class is the class which has faced the most losses, particularly because of commercialization and modernization. Also, the Knights Hospitallers conquered the island of Rhodes and ruled it for 200 years. They then lost it to the Turks and retreated to Malta. They then became known as the Knights of Malta. They then defended Malta against an Islamic invasion, which has been overlooked in the history of the West as an event similar to the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. There were also Spanish military orders who were involved in the Reconquista to retake Iberia from Moorish Islamic rule, a conquest which happened 800 years earlier, thanks to the betrayal of the Sephardic Jews in opening the city gates across Spain and acting as garrisons on behalf of the Moors, as well as the failure of the Visigoth aristocrats to defend their own homeland from invasions, and their mistake in trusting the Sephardics to not betray them. It should also be noted that while he was not a part of an order of knights, Charles Martel, an early medieval king, also defended the West from Islamic conquest, and if he hadn't, then France would have fallen just like Spain did. He went on to be the grandfather of Charlemagne, the founder of the Carolingian Empire, which was the first incarnation of the Holy Roman Empire. This monastic military order continued to rule Malta until Napoleon came and ended their reign. These are some of the other knightly military orders, aside from the Templars, who also played a role in the history of the European aristocracy. Knights, mercenaries, and marauding nobles. It was also common for there to be knights who were not associated with any lord or monastic knightly order. These knights were often mercenaries, or would simply act as highwaymen and forest thieves, marauding nobles running through the forest or through the night looking for anyone to kill or steal from. The people who lived in the city communes would close the gates at night, and they would say to not go outside at night because there were nobles out there. There were also gangs of mercenaries, known as free companies, who played a major role in war, including the Redshanks from Scotland, who went to Ireland and fought wars for the Irish military throughout the 1500s, and the Ecoccia, who fought for the French during the 1400s until the end of the Hundred Years' War. These Ecoccia would pillage the French countryside during peacetime and became known as the routiers. Some of these mercenaries actually managed to take political power for themselves, such as the Anglo-Saxons who were invited to England by the Celtic king Vortigern as mercenaries, and then they managed to take over all of Britannia. The Romans hired them a few centuries earlier, but they managed to contain them with their own military power and make sure they didn't get out of control. The Celtic kings of sub-Roman Britain did not have that same capacity to contain them, so they ended up being overtaken by them instead. In Italy, mercenaries also managed to gain political power as well. The condottieri overthrew some of the merchant city republics that hired them and became its new leaders. Aristocratic inheritance and primogeniture. It is also worth talking about how the inheritance of the aristocracy worked. The medieval European aristocracy largely followed the system of primogeniture. This meant that the firstborn son would take all of his father's land, wealth, and his title, while his other sons would get nothing, and his daughters would be married off to other lords and knights. So, if a duke had 5 sons and 3 daughters, his first son would become a duke, his second, third, and fourth sons would become knights and either go on to work for their duke brother, or they would go work for a different lord, or they would become highway robbers, or join a free company, while his fifth son would become a bishop because it was common for a lord to want one of his sons to become a monk, or an abbot, or a bishop, and maintain connections with the clergy and the power that comes with it. And as stated earlier, he would have to find husbands for his 3 daughters, which was sometimes challenging, and it was not simply a situation of having to find them suitable men. It was also important for them to forge marriage alliances that would make the father and his heir secure in their wealth and power. The Holy Roman Empire and the masculine spiritual pole of the West. Charlemagne was known during his life as Charles the Great, and while he was king of the Franks, the Germanic tribal ethnic group that went on to become known as the French people, he would also become the first person in the West in almost 400 years to be crowned Emperor of the Romans. He did so after having conquered much of Europe and much of ancient Rome's old territory. Including some areas that the Romans never conquered before, such as Germany. His empire included much of the areas we now call Germany, northern Italy, and France. We already talked earlier about how most ethnic groups in Europe had a system of primogeniture, where the firstborn son was the heir who got everything, but there was another system that was less common, where every son would get an even slice of the father's territories and wealth, and this system was called partible inheritance. It was practiced by the Franks in particular, and in so doing it led to the fall of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, because his 3 grandchildren split his empire into 3 sections. The Holy Roman Empire was refounded by Otto the Great, who in 962 AD rebuilt Charlemagne's earlier empire, and this time it would actually be given the name by the Church, which has rung through the ages, the Holy Roman Empire. It was not actually called this during Charlemagne's time, although Charlemagne was known as the King of the Franks and the Emperor of the Romans in his own time. And it was this empire that was really medieval Christendom's attempt to unite and become a spiritual and political unity. The Emperor embodied the masculine unity that Christendom could have achieved, and the fact that they never conquered England, nor most of Italy, in no small part thanks to the opposition from the Church, shows how the Holy Roman Empire effectively failed in its mission of becoming the spiritual pole that Western civilization was to be founded on. In modern times, we will need a new pole to build on and look up to. It was not possible for the Church to be this pole, and this is why the Church faced so much opposition from the Empire, then from the Templars at the same time, and when these movements failed, it only made sense that something like Protestantism would take root. It is only a shame because Protestantism is not like the Holy Roman Empire or the Knights Templar, because these were spiritual masculine movements, while Protestantism was simply the worst and most egalitarian and slavish elements of Christianity making a comeback. It was foolish for so many Germanic kings and English kings to side with it. They clearly didn't know what they were getting into. In the process, they opened up the floodgates of egalitarianism, which eventually led to more dangerous movements like the Puritans, Calvinists, and Anabaptists, who were radical egalitarians, who were far more dangerous to the aristocrats than the Catholic Church was. But back to the empire. It is also worth noting how the Holy Roman Empire was governed. In the days of Charlemagne, it was governed like an absolute monarchy. But in the days of the later Holy Roman Empire, after Otto the Great, it was governed not just by the emperor, but also by the imperial diet. The imperial diet included imperial princes as well as imperial abbots and imperial bishops, who were outranked by prince abbots and prince bishops, but it was ultimately headed by the emperor himself. And as for the capital, it would be periodically moved all over the territory of the empire to make sure that no one area got too strong or too overrepresented in the government, which meant the imperial diet was being moved all over the empire's territory, and this helped cement the empire as the spiritual foundation for the whole of the medieval civilization. It acted as a spiritual foundation for the whole culture of Europe. It was a masculine spiritual foundation built on the warrior caste, and the imperial diet was the ever-moving center, which was good because that meant that the center was sharing its radiating energies across the empire more evenly and was therefore helping to spiritually enliven and make firm its foundations as the bedrock of European culture. While most reactionaries believed that it was the church which made up the bedrock of European culture, it was not. It was the Holy Roman Empire and its imperial diet as well as its emperor. The church had always been the highly corrupt priest corps, which while it could have been purified and made into a better institution, it was sadly not so. And if it had been purified, then it would have been more likely that it would have accepted its rightful position as the wife of the empire, not as its husband. European civilization started to fall apart when the church rebelled against the empire, and the church was not a worthy custodian of the civilization. So when challengers in the form of Protestantism rose up, it was not possible for the church to stop them. They were not spiritually strong enough. And it didn't help when misguided English and German monarchs started embracing the Reformation. They did so to get away from the church and its ancient and awful and corrupted power. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation was a fight between two sides that both damaged Western civilization. They were both right in some respects, and they were both horribly wrong in other respects. The clergy and its power as the feminine spiritual pole of the West. Monasteries, bishoprics, and papal states, as well as the Vatican itself, were also very influential during the Middle Ages, and they also were in many ways an extension of the aristocracy itself. The reason why was because, as stated earlier, the upper levels of the monastic movements and the clergy were literally members of the aristocracy most of the time. The reason why was because when the church needed people to run itself at the upper levels, they needed people who were experienced at running things, and they couldn't use peasants who had no idea how to run a large institution. They needed either the sons of lords or the sons of wealthy merchants. But usually they got lords, because they were more prominent and powerful, especially in the early Middle Ages. The church would advertise itself as being a meritocracy, where peasants who joined at the low levels would have the means to rank up the hierarchy and become influential. But this rarely happened in practice, and the reason why is a mix of peasants not being qualified for the job and also of just overt preference for the sons of nobles. Later into the Middle Ages, the sons of wealthy and powerful merchant elites started becoming high-level clergy, probably because that is when the merchant elites started becoming more well-developed and therefore more influential and powerful. The clergy and the monasteries did not reproduce out of a sense of wanting to be celibate holy men, and for this reason they were not able to pass on their titles and powers the way other military or merchant elites of the time could. And this is why they so desperately needed another class of people to constantly replenish them in their ranks. This then leads to the question of how did this affect them? Well, the answer is that the monasteries tended to be filled with people who were more devout and less hypocritical. The monks practiced vows of poverty and did not dress nicely. They dressed in basic-looking clothing, and they lived communally and frugally off of whatever was donated to them, from the peasants, the aristocracy, the merchants, and the royalty. Whatever land the monastery held was managed by the monks. They would work the land themselves and live similarly to how peasants lived. Oftentimes they were peasants in origin, although it was fairly common for them to also come from the aristocracy. This is greatly contrasted by the other more high-ranking members of the clergy. First, it should be noted that there was a distinction between the monastic clergy and the secular clergy. The secular clergy were often peasants who could own homes and live peasant lives, except they still had to be celibate. And the elite bishops could be wealthy, have serfs, and even have knights as vassals and counts as vassals, but they could still not have children or pass on their lands or title. Instead, the church would get the land and title back after the bishop's death. They would then give the land and title of bishop to a new, usually unrelated person, often from an aristocratic family, though sometimes they could come from some enterprising peasant who managed to work his way up the church hierarchy, though this was rare and it was usually an aristocrat. Sometimes it would even be a merchant or artisan. Then you had the monastic clergy. They lived communally and took vows of poverty. The leader of each monastery was called an abbot. The female version was called an abbess, and she would run a nunnery instead of a monastery. The secular clergy, namely the bishops and above, such as the archbishops or even the pope, tended to live luxuriously like the other aristocrats, and this tended to be threatened every so often by the monastic movements, which needed to be kept in check, because they would occasionally make huge claims saying that the church leadership was corrupt for not going along with the vows of poverty and living luxuriously, saying that this is not what Christ intended, and that this is not what a true Christian life is meant to be. You can already see here the precursor to Protestant thought. The upper levels of the church hierarchy also included the Vatican itself, and the Vatican was the city-state that the church was and is based out of. The popes always came from elite families, on a few cases, the Medici specifically, and it acted and still acts as a city within a city, where it is inside Rome, and yet it also has far-reaching influence, both inside the city that was once home to the imperial element, and also across the entire Western European world. It is a shame to see this corrupt priestly element inside what was once the spiritual center of the imperial element that ruled over a vast and beautiful cosmopolitan realm. It is also worth noting the papal states, which were exactly what they sound like. City-states run by high-ranking clergy and directly controlled by the Vatican. There were only a few of these states, and they are in many ways the cousins of the Crusader states that appeared in the Holy Land and were run by monastic knights, warrior ascetics. But those knights were trying to base their spiritual headquarters in Jerusalem. They were trying to make a new center for Western Christian civilization. Rome and the Vatican were trying to create states that were completely controlled as a way to centralize power, so they would not have to rely on nobles who they didn't and couldn't trust entirely to run things for them. And it is also worth noting that Niccolo Machiavelli himself had something to say about these priestly governments, which was that they were incredibly hard to overthrow. And the reason for being hard to overthrow was because they were ruled by priests, as this was a great defense against insurrections on its own. Because as Machiavelli said, priestly governments are incredibly hard to overthrow because the people find the rule of the priestly element too intoxicating. They worship the priests, no matter how corrupt they become, no matter how barbaric or tyrannical they are. The priest just has this ability to sweep a haze in front of the people's eyes. And because of this, they are able to control the masses better than any other form of government can, except maybe democracy, because it appeals to the people themselves, while theocracy appeals to the people's sense of holiness and sense of wanting to connect with the divine forces and be close to those forces. And they feel close to them through this intermediary class, which has swindled the commoners and in some cases even many of the nobles into believing that they themselves are those divine forces incarnate, or at the very least, the necessary intermediaries between those divine forces and man. They are not necessary, and any priest or priestly person or priest class who makes such claims is inherently corrupt and has taken on too much power. power which they were never worthy of, and power which never belonged to them. This can also be seen in the long and dark history of the various corrupt priesthoods which have existed in history even outside Christianity. Examples of corrupt priestly elites in other cultures. The Brahmins of Vedic India wrote the laws of Manu late in the history of the Vedic civilization. They wrote them only after this civilization was already declining, and in so doing, they established themselves as being a hereditary caste, where they portrayed themselves as being a necessary intermediary between the divine and man. Even though all of the Brahmins originally came from the same Aryan warrior Kshatriya caste as the other warriors did, they still promoted this lie that they were somehow different from them. They also portrayed themselves as being beyond reproach and unquestionable, as semi-divine themselves. They naturally took advantage of this new status they gave themselves in the era of late Vedic culture, and even though there were many revolts by the warrior Kshatriya caste, none of them were ever enough, for not enough Kshatriyas would band together to overthrow the priestly Brahmin caste. And then the Druids of the Celtic world. They were known for having large wicker man burnings, where large numbers of people were sacrificed to the gods. In spite of these barbaric practices, Julius Caesar states that these barbarian priests were revered by the Celtic Gaulish people, and that they were so revered that the only way he could subjugate Gaul in the name of the empire was by killing them off completely. This was unusual because typically the Romans were tolerant of most religions in their empire, the Druids being one of the only exceptions, aside from the Jews and the Christians. And the reason why was because all of these groups caused trouble for the Roman government. And in the case of the Druids, the reason why was because the Romans absolutely could not make the Gaulish people see the new Roman government as legitimate and make them kneel before them as their new masters. Instead, they would keep worshipping their tyrannical Druid priest kings, no matter how treacherous they were. So Caesar felt his actions were necessary. This is the reverse of the outcome of the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, where the church defeated the empire. Instead, the empire defeated the priestly elite, and this is another example of what Machiavelli said, which was that theocracies are dangerous because priestly elites are among the hardest elites to overthrow imaginable. These priestly elites can be seen as all having made the erroneous claim that they themselves were beyond the pale and holy men who were either a necessary connection to the divine or even the divine themselves. This is the hallmark of a corrupted priestly element. They are also never meant to rule on their own. They are always meant to rule on behalf of a warrior element, or better, a royal element, or an imperial element. Not having all of the power and letting others rule for them keeps them honest, and keeps them in a state where they won't be corrupted by powers that they are not worthy of, and it makes it easier for them to actually live up to being holy men or men of the gods, because they can focus on that instead of focusing on statecraft, which is mostly distracting from the main job of a priestly elite, which is to protect the state and society from supernatural threats, and to keep a watch out for those threats if they come. They are advisors to power, not power itself. They are not state power, nor are they divine power. They are merely specialists who are knowledgeable about the unseen world and its nature, and its entities. Others could easily replace them, and they are not special in the way they are seen by the Catholic faith. They are special, though, in the sense that they are ritual experts, and experts in the supernatural, and for this reason are due respect, for this is no small feat, but they are not above reproach, and if they claim so, then they have already taken the first gigantic leap towards corruption and decline. And if they are not held back, disciplined, and forced to recant immediately, or disbanded immediately, then they will take over the state almost immediately. More on the Italian city-state and its importance to the history of the two spiritual poles of the West. Now back to the Italian city-state. How did the nobles adapt to this new phenomenon of the Italian city-state? The answer is that many of them moved out of the country and into the cities. The lords all had estates and land in the country with serfs who worked the land, so what they did was they bought houses in the cities and built towers as defenses against attack, either from an angry mob of townspeople or from other nobles who might want to challenge their authority or steal their wealth, or burn down their homes and kill their families. They could still own homes in the country with serfs and all, and they would usually live part-time in the city and part-time in their castles in the country. During the later Middle Ages, this became common practice for nobles throughout Italy. There was a lot of street violence in these city-states between different noble families. The nobles would even make graffiti in the streets. They would write on the walls things like, quote, "filthy peasants," end quote. There were usually different political parties for the nobles and the people, or the popolo, as they were called. To vote meant either being a freeman, which meant also being an artisan or a merchant to make a living, or it meant being an aristocrat. The serfs in the countryside were not allowed to vote, and usually they didn't even enter the city. The nobles also would bring their servants from the countryside, who helped run their houses, with them into the cities. They were not allowed to vote either. The people would sometimes get the upper hand, and when they did, that usually meant that it was the merchant and artisan classes that were getting the upper hand. Also, there was a certain degree of social mobility, because sometimes a powerful merchant would end up in the noble party and end up being considered as a noble. Also, it was not uncommon for the nobles themselves to lead the people's party against their own class for their own self-interest. Much like other populist movements in history, where elites lead people's movements against the main branch of the elite, the reason why the people even wanted a political party so much was because they did not like the aristocrats very much, and they felt that they were too tyrannical, and this is why they wanted their own opportunity for political power so much. They wanted power and self-determination for themselves, and not to have to rely on the whims of aristocrats who were sometimes tyrannical, although they did not know what they would be unleashing, since they would end up electing some very vicious tyrants in the name of the People's Party, who would often end up being worse than any typical government run by aristocrats or old-school monarchs would be. The role of usury in the politics of the medieval world. In medieval Europe, only Jews were allowed to charge interest on loans, because in Christianity there were prohibitions on usury, so Christians were not allowed to charge usury, but since Christians still needed credit sometimes, this meant that they had to outsource the practice of usury to another group of people. This ended up being the Jews, because the Jews had no such prohibition on usury in their religion. It is worth noting that the same practice of outsourcing the practice of usury to Jews was also done in the Islamic world at the same time, since the Islamic world also had a religious taboo on usury. This was not very smart, because it meant that both the Christian elites in the West and in the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Islamic elites in the Middle East and North Africa, were effectively giving a monopoly on interest to this one minority group who they often had a contentious relationship with. Many Christian kings and Muslim kings did not like the Jews, and the Jews were not always very good business partners to work with because they would often charge way too much usury on a loan and cause an entire village or even an entire kingdom to go into bankruptcy, and this would lead to violent massacres as a backlash. For this reason, the church decided to allow the Medici family, who were an Italian aristocratic family that they were aligned with, to charge usury on loans. When this happened, it led to the rise of another monopoly, because now this Catholic aristocratic family was backed by the Pope, and it was not long before the Medici family had branches of their bank all over Europe. They ended up becoming the most powerful family in Europe for centuries. This shows the power that usury holds. Aside from the Jews and the Medicis, the only other group of people that was allowed to charge interest in medieval Europe was the already mentioned Knights Templar. They also developed a pan-European banking network as well. This is also probably another reason why the Templars were killed by the Medici-aligned church, for fear that not only would the Templars be a spiritual competitor to the church, but that they would also be a banking and usury competitor to the Medicis. It's also worth noting that the Templars were accused of worshipping a demon. This demon's name was Baphomet, which is interesting because usually the church only made accusations like this against either pagans or heretical Christian sects. This suggests that they actually saw the Templars as a real spiritual threat. It's also interesting that the name Baphomet had never been recorded before the Templar trials. It seems like a strange thing for the church to just make up, and so it is possible that the accusations against them of worshipping this demon creature may have been in part true, but may have been naturally exaggerated by the inquisitorial authorities. I don't think the Knights Templar were worshipping a demon. I think it is more likely that they were practicing a new religion, probably some new esoteric form of Christianity, especially since they were said to have found a lot of lost scrolls underneath Solomon's temple when they excavated it. They probably found some kind of ancient Jewish secret knowledge, which they rediscovered and started practicing. Maybe Baphomet was some kind of ancient Near Eastern god, or even a secret image of Yahweh for all we know, but this is hard to say. We cannot take seriously when the church accuses its enemies of demon worship, because they always do that, so it is impossible to tell when they really are demonolatrists or not. During the Renaissance, the Medici continued to grow in power, and they still considered themselves to be aristocrats. They still held titles, and a few of them even became pope, which makes sense considering how close they had always been to the papacy, and because the papacy was not a hereditary title, and also because, as mentioned earlier, it was customary for aristocratic families to have one of their sons join the clergy or a monastery. The Medici used their money to fund all of the arts and sciences of their day in Renaissance Italy. They also used it to fund esoteric research into the occult, in the case of Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. They also used their money to fund scholarly work, such as Ficino's translating Plato's complete works into Latin. They also funded the revival of classical architecture, which started to replace the earlier Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages. In spite of whatever corruption, the Medicis used their money to make Italy great and to revive the Western classical spirit. The entire humanist movement was made possible with Medici funding, and it probably wouldn't have been possible otherwise, especially considering how the church was suspicious of these types of things. Anything involving ancient knowledge was considered suspect, since it was pagan. As it was, Thomas Aquinas had to fight for the acceptance of Aristotle, since the earlier church father St. Augustine explicitly stated that learning anything outside Christianity was a waste of time and could possibly lead to heresy. Aquinas was a trailblazer, but the Renaissance and people like Ficino and Pico took it way further, and if the Medicis had not held the church back and funded the entire humanist endeavor, then it may not have been possible for any of this to have happened. It is also worth noting that they also funded the translation of Arabic and Hebrew texts, as well as the massive revival of Greek texts. This led to the birth of Christian Kabbalah, as well as the revival of Greek learning in the West, for the first time since antiquity, because Greek had largely been lost in the Latin West since the fall of Rome 1,000 years earlier. Although it should be noted that knowledge of the Greek language and literature did not die out in the Arab world, where it was still studied throughout the Middle Ages, and it was also the main language of the Byzantine Empire during the same time. The aristocracy and how it adapted to its changing circumstance during the Renaissance. The rest of the aristocracy during the Renaissance adapted to their environment by becoming involved in business, finance, and trade as well. This then leads to questions about whether they are even still aristocrats at this point. I would argue that they still were, since they were still mostly hereditary, with a few exceptions, and they were still mostly warriors, often fighting with each other in the cities in addition to the countryside. There were certain magnates who were from the burgher class, but managed to rise to the point where they were granted a title. but usually only after gaining a certain amount of prestige and influence within a given city-state. And aristocrats who participated in commerce were still aristocrats at heart, who were culturally superior to the common people and the nouveau riche merchant elites, who were corrosive to their power. There were also many tyrants who rose up in these city-states, usually elected by the people, either representing the noble party or the people's party. Either way, it did not matter, whichever party was more convenient for the aspiring tyrant. These tyrants would come from either the noble class or the merchant and artisan class, although they usually came from the noble class. It should also be noted that the people's parties in these city-states were more of an elite merchant and elite artisan party. Rather than being run by the people, it was run by the rich. Sometimes it even had aristocrats running in it. And the noble party was usually just made up of nobles, although sometimes it did have new money merchants and artisans in it as well. But as far as the tyrants go, they tended to not last very long in power. Usually they only stayed in power for 1, maybe 2 generations before losing power. They would usually have their son take over for them if they wanted. These tyrannies were really just young and unstable monarchies. And they did tend to be tyrannical, and this is what made them unstable compared to the older kings, who tended to, on average, be less tyrannical. These nouveau monarchs did not have the skills to maintain their family's rule for centuries the way the older monarchical families did. It was probably that they were more experienced at it that made them so much better at it. Tyranny was itself an expression of aristocratic values and tendencies in that they were usually aristocrats themselves, and also because they tended to embody the values of power and the desire for absolute power and supremacy. This sense of power and hierarchy are emblematic of what it means to be an aristocrat in attitude and mentality. The aristocrats of Renaissance Italy and their experiences were an important event in the history of the aristocracy, because they were the first aristocrats to have to find a way to adapt, because they were facing new threats from a new competing class of merchants and artisans. These merchants and artisans in the cities now had the ability to challenge the aristocrats' power in a way they had not been able to before, when society was more rural and feudal. And it was the aristocrats' journey to try and keep some elements of feudalism, also known as aristocratic rule, alive in the cities, in this new urban environment. The aristocrats of Renaissance Italy had to adapt to a changing world that was becoming more commercial, more modern, and more urban-centric. They actually adapted to their new environment very well, but it was not meant to last, because what came after would affect them too greatly: the rise of absolute monarchy and the decline of aristocrats. In early modern times, the aristocracy would be greatly undermined in its power and influence by the rise of absolutism. The new absolute monarchies were formed when the kings of Europe started centralizing their power by greatly expanding their use of bureaucrats as a way of undermining the landed lords, who ruled most of their kingdoms in their name. They mainly used freemen who were not from the nobility, so as not to give power to the nobles in some other way. The aristocracy always had the upper hand. They used many freemen who were merchants to staff their new and much larger bureaucracy, but they also used many aristocrats as well. They did not have to worry because being bureaucrats did not give the aristocrats the same power and autonomy that being semi-independent lords gave them. The aristocracy always had the upper hand on the kings historically, because while the king ruled in name, the truth was that they actually only ruled their own personal territories, because the local lords were the ones who actually ruled most of the kingdom. And because of this, the king only had a limited amount of power. He could order the lord to do something, and while legally they had to obey their king, in practice they often didn't. This meant that the king had to have a good reputation for winning battles, so he could attract a large following of warriors who would be willing to put their lives and treasure on the line, in hope of him winning, and therefore being able to win more treasure and land than they already had. This made aristocratic monarchy a very meritocratic system. It was not entirely meritocratic, though, because you still had to be born into the warrior class to compete in any of this at all. So when the king started using freemen bureaucrats and aristocratic bureaucrats to create a large state apparatus which strengthened his own power over his kingdom and undermined the power of his lords, this meant that these lords would over time be reduced to being an idle aristocracy, and this was a fate worse than death, because not having anything to do and just living purely for pleasure without any meaning can only lead to nihilism and aimlessness. And while some of these lords would become bureaucrats, that was not true of most of them. Most of them would in fact become an idle aristocracy. The contemporary state of aristocrats. The contemporary state of the surviving aristocratic families is that they have become a people of little account. They just exist now. They are even more idle than they were 300 years ago. But now they are not creating a great culture like they were in pre-revolutionary France. Instead, they are just assimilating into the culture of the wealthy communist elite. It is a shame to have to watch the decline of so great a class. A class who went from being all about valor in the ancient and medieval world to being a decadent yet cultured and beautiful people of early modernity. Then they became inbred and stupid during modernity, followed by failing to stop the onslaught of the communists and capitalists, and not even trying to stop the world wars, not even realizing how bad it was going to be for Europe, and even entering into combat voluntarily without taking into account how much the nature of war itself had changed, and in doing so, they got themselves killed during the wars. They have become even more disenchanted from their ancestral ways, and they hang out with the bourgeois elites they once frowned on. They have become one of them. Now they are increasingly indistinguishable from the wealthy communist elite that rules in the early 21st century West.